Historians thought this was just a family portrait until they zoomed in. The box arrived at the Kansas Historical Society on a humid August morning, shipped from an estate sale in Topeka. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, were dozens of photographs spanning several generations of Kansas families. Archivist Sarah Mitchell carefully unwrapped each one, documenting provenance and condition as she went. Most were typical: weddings, graduations, farmsteads. Then she uncovered a formal portrait that made her pause. The photograph, mounted on thick cardboard backing, showed a prosperous family from the turn of the century. A stern father in a dark suit, a mother in high-collared lace, and 4 children arranged by height, all staring solemnly at the camera. The studio mark read Porter & Sons Photography, Wichita, Kansas, 1904. The family appeared wealthy based on their clothing. The mother's dress alone would have cost several months' wages for a working family. The children were immaculately groomed. The boys in matching sailor suits, the girls in white dresses with elaborate ribbons. Sarah turned the photograph over, hoping for names. Someone had written in faded pencil, "The Hendricks family, summer 1904. Nothing more. No first names, no indication of who the children were or what had become of them. She set it aside, with others requiring further research and continued cataloging. But something about the photograph nagged at her. She picked it up again, studying the faces more carefully. The parents looked rigid, which was typical of Victorian photography requiring long exposure times. But the children's expressions seemed off somehow, not just solemn but almost fearful. "Probably just uncomfortable in those formal clothes," Sarah muttered, setting it down again. The high collars and tight bodices of the era were notoriously uncomfortable, especially for children forced to sit still for several minutes while the photographer prepared his equipment and exposed the plate. Still, the photograph haunted her through the rest of the day. That evening, she decided to scan it at high resolution for their digital archive, never suspecting what the technology would reveal. Sarah began the digitization process the following morning using the Society's new high-resolution scanner, capable of capturing details far beyond what the human eye could perceive. The equipment had been a significant investment, but it allowed them to preserve deteriorating photographs and make them accessible to researchers worldwide. She positioned the Hendricks family portrait carefully on the scanner bed, adjusting the settings for maximum resolution. The scan took nearly 10 minutes, the machine capturing the image in overlapping sections that software would stitch into a single massive file. When the scan completed, Sarah opened it on her computer and began the routine process of checking quality and adjusting contrast. She zoomed in to verify sharpness, examining the fine details of the clothing, the texture of the studio backdrop, the clarity of the faces. Then she noticed something strange in the composition. The family members were arranged in a typical Victorian portrait formation, parents seated in the center, children standing around them, but the spacing seemed odd. There was a gap between the second and third child, a space large enough for another person. Sarah zoomed in further on that area. The studio backdrop behind the family showed a painted scene of columns and drapery, but in that gap, the pattern seemed disrupted. She adjusted the image brightness and contrast, and her breath caught. There, barely visible, was the ghostly outline of another child. A girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in that empty space. She was so faint that Sarah could see right through her to the backdrop behind, but the outline was unmistakable. The shape of a dress, the suggestion of hair, the faint oval of a face. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, leaning closer to the screen. She'd seen plenty of photographic anomalies, double exposures, light leaks, chemical stains on old plates. But this was different. This looked like deliberate removal, like someone had carefully erased a child from the family portrait. She spent the next hour examining every pixel of that ghostly figure, documenting what she could see. The child had been there in the original exposure, standing with the family. But somehow, through primitive photo retouching techniques available in 1904, someone had tried to erase her from existence. Sarah immediately contacted Dr. Marcus Webb, a photography historian at the University of Kansas who specialized in early 20th century photographic techniques. When he arrived that afternoon, she had the image displayed on her largest monitor, the ghostly outline of the 5th child clearly visible. Marcus studied the image in silence, occasionally asking Sarah to adjust the contrast or zoom in on specific areas. Finally, he sat back, his expression troubled. That's deliberate retouching. See how the backdrop pattern is painted over the figure? Someone used India ink and fine brushes to manually obscure the child on the glass plate negative. Why would anyone do that? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. In 1904, several possible reasons, none of them good. The child might have died between when the photograph was taken and when prints were made. Families sometimes removed deceased children from portraits to avoid painful reminders. He zoomed in on the faint outline, but usually that was done more completely. This looks hasty, almost like whoever did it wanted the removal to be reversible, or wanted to leave evidence that the child had existed. Sarah pulled up what little information they had about the Hendricks family. The estate sale documentation showed the photographs had come from a house on Topeka Avenue that had been in the Hendricks family for over a century. The last owner, Margaret Hendricks, had died at 93 with no children, and distant cousins had sold the property. I need to find out who these people were, Sarah said. I need to know who that fifth child was and what happened to her. Marcus nodded slowly, still studying the ghostly outline. Sarah, there's something else. Look at the other children's positions. See how the second child has her hand extended slightly, like she's holding someone's hand? And the third child is leaning away from the gap, like there's someone there pushing against him. Sarah looked closer. He was right. The visible children were positioned as if interacting with someone in that empty space. Someone who had been carefully painted out of existence, but whose presence still affected the composition. They photographed all 5 children together, Marcus concluded. Then someone decided one of them shouldn't be remembered. But they couldn't quite erase all the evidence. Sarah spent the next 3 days in the Kansas State Archives, digging through census records, city directories, and newspaper archives from the early 1900s. She finally found the Hendricks family in the 1900 census. Robert Hendricks, age 38, grain merchant. His wife Helen, age 35, and 5 children. Margaret, age 12. Robert Jr., age 10. Emma, age 8. John, age 6. And Sarah, age 4, 5 children. Sarah stared at the census record, her heart racing. By 1904, when the photograph was taken, there should have been 5 children in the portrait. But only 4 were visible and 1 had been erased. She quickly searched for the 1910 census. The Hendricks family was listed again: Robert, Helen, and 4 children: Margaret, Robert Jr., John, and a new baby, Charles. Emma's name was gone. Sarah cross-referenced with vital records, searching for a death certificate for Emma Hendricks between 1900 and 1910. Nothing. No death record in Wichita, Topeka, or anywhere in Kansas. It was as if Emma had simply vanished. She expanded her search to newspapers, looking for any mention of the Hendricks family during those years. Most were society page items: Mrs. Hendricks hosting a tea, Mr. Hendricks elected to the Chamber of Commerce Board. Then, in the Topeka Daily Capital from November 1903, she found a small item that made her blood run cold. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Hendricks have made the difficult decision to place their daughter Emma, age 11, in the care of the State Hospital for the Insane at Osawatomie, where she will receive treatment for mental deficiency. The family requests privacy during this trying time. Sarah sat back, the implications washing over her. Emma hadn't died. She'd been institutionalized, sent away to the state asylum. And then, when the family had their portrait taken the following summer, they'd had her erased from the photograph as if she'd never existed. She immediately began researching the Osawatomie State Hospital, and what she found was horrifying. In the early 1900s, mental deficiency was a catch-all diagnosis applied to children with developmental disabilities, learning difficulties, or even just behavioral problems that embarrassed their families. The conditions in such institutions were notoriously brutal: overcrowding, abuse, inadequate food, and medical care. Sarah needed to find out what had happened to Emma Hendricks after her family erased her from their history. The Osawatomie State Hospital, now closed and converted to a museum, maintained archived records of patients admitted during its operation. Sarah drove the 2 hours from Topeka, armed with Emma's name and approximate admission date. The museum curator, an elderly man named Gerald Foster, led her to a climate-controlled room filled with file boxes. Most families don't want to claim relatives who were institutionalized, Gerald said sadly, pulling boxes from 1903. Mental illness and disability carried such stigma back then. Children were hidden away, their existence denied. You're one of the few researchers who's ever asked about a specific patient. Sarah found Emma's admission file in the third box. The record was heartbreaking in its clinical brevity. Emma Hendricks, admitted November 15, 1903, age 11. Diagnosis: feeble-minded, educable imbecile grade. Committed by parents Robert and Helen Hendricks. Reason: child exhibits slow learning, difficulty with speech, inappropriate emotional responses. Family reports she is an embarrassment in social situations. The admission photograph attached to the file showed a thin girl with dark hair and frightened eyes, wearing a plain institutional dress. Sarah's hands trembled as she compared the photo to the ghostly outline in the family portrait. Same face, same child. This was Emma, erased from her family but preserved in asylum records. The medical notes were sparse and disturbing. Emma was housed in the children's ward, which by 1903 standards meant a large dormitory with minimal supervision and virtually no education or enrichment. Monthly reports described her as quiet, compliant, no trouble. There were no records of family visits. No letters. No indication that anyone from the Hendricks family ever acknowledged her existence after dropping her at the asylum gates. Then Sarah found the final entry, dated March 17, 1905. Patient Emma Hendricks deceased. Cause: pneumonia complicated by malnutrition. Body unclaimed by family. Burial in hospital cemetery, Section C. Unmarked grave. Emma had died less than a year after the family portrait was taken, alone in an institution, her body buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. She was 12 years old, and her family had already erased her from their history before she even died. Sarah couldn't let Emma's story end there. She returned to the Historical Society and began researching Porter and Sons Photography, the studio that had taken the Hendricks family portrait. Perhaps the photographer had left some record of why Emma had been removed from the photograph. The studio had operated in Wichita from 1895 to 1920, run by Samuel Porter and later his son James. Sarah discovered that James Porter's personal papers had been donated to the Wichita Public Library in 1975. She drove to Wichita that afternoon and requested access to the collection. The papers included business ledgers, correspondence, and several leather-bound journals where James Porter had recorded his thoughts about his work. Sarah found an entry dated July 12, 1904, shortly after the Hendricks portrait would have been taken. Received a troubling request from Mr. Hendricks today. He wants his daughter removed from the family portrait we made last month. Not deceased, as is sometimes the case, but no longer part of the family as he put it. I inquired further and learned the child has been institutionalized. Mr. Hendricks was quite firm that he wants no record of her existence. He paid double my usual fee for me to retouch the negative. I have agreed to do the work, as I need the money, and cannot afford to offend a prominent client. But I find this request deeply disturbing. The child existed. She was part of this family. To erase her seems cruel beyond measure. I will do the retouching, but I will do it poorly on purpose, leaving enough evidence that anyone looking closely might see what was done. Perhaps someday, when attitudes toward such children are more enlightened, someone will look at this photograph and ask questions. The child deserves to be remembered, even if her family wishes to forget her. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. The photographer had deliberately left evidence of Emma's existence, a silent protest against the family's cruelty. He couldn't refuse the commission without potentially losing his business, but he could ensure that Emma wouldn't be completely erased from history. She photocopied the journal entry and continued searching through Porter's papers. Near the end of his life, in a journal entry from 1918, he returned to the subject. I still think about that Hendricks girl sometimes, the one they made me erase from their portrait. I wonder what became of her. I hope she found kindness somewhere, though I doubt it. Those places they send such children are little better than prisons. Sarah decided to research what had happened to the 4 visible Hendricks children, the ones who had been allowed to remain in the family portrait and family history. She traced their lives through census records, city directories, marriage records, and obituaries. Margaret, the eldest, married a banker in 1912 and moved to Kansas City. She had 3 children and died in 1967 at age 79. Her lengthy obituary described her as a pillar of the community, active in charitable work. There was no mention of a sister named Emma. Robert Jr. took over his father's grain business and became quite wealthy. He served on numerous civic boards and was known for his philanthropy. He died in 1963, and his obituary listed his surviving siblings as John and Margaret. Again, no mention of Emma. John became a doctor and practiced in Topeka until his retirement. He died in 1970, remembered for his dedication to his patients and his family. His obituary mentioned his siblings Margaret and Robert Jr. Emma's name was absent. The youngest child visible in the photograph, Sarah, died of influenza in 1919 at age 23, before she could leave much of a historical record. None of them, not one of the surviving siblings, ever acknowledged that they'd had a sister named Emma. She had been erased not just from a photograph but from the entire family narrative, as if she'd never existed at all. Sarah found this collective silence almost more disturbing than the original act of institutionalization. It suggested a family agreement, a pact to never speak Emma's name, to pretend she had never been born. 4 children grew to adulthood, married, had children of their own, and went to their graves without ever mentioning their sister. But Sarah also found something else. In Margaret's personal papers, donated to the Kansas City Public Library after her death, there was a single item that suggested the erasure hadn't been complete. A pressed flower, carefully preserved between the pages of a Bible, with a note in Margaret's handwriting. From Emma's grave, 1945. So Margaret had known where Emma was buried. At some point 40 years after Emma's death, Margaret had visited the unmarked grave at Osawatomie. She'd picked a flower and pressed it in her Bible, a secret memorial that her own children would never understand. It was a tiny acknowledgement, but Margaret had never told Emma's story, never publicly recognized her existence. Sarah faced a decision. She had uncovered a tragic story of a child erased from history. But the Hendricks family descendants might not want this dark chapter revealed. She reached out to several genealogists and eventually located Linda Patterson, a great-great-granddaughter of Margaret Hendricks, living in Lawrence, Kansas. Linda agreed to meet, and Sarah showed her everything she'd discovered. The photograph with the ghostly 5th child, the census records, the asylum files, the photographer's journal entries. Linda listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew," Linda whispered. "My grandmother never mentioned having an aunt named Emma. I knew my family came from Topeka, that they were successful in business. But this ... double quotes." She touched the photograph gently, tracing the outline of the erased child. "This is horrible. How could they do this? How could they just throw away a child?" "Disability stigma was intense in that era," Sarah explained. Families often institutionalized children who didn't fit social expectations. And once those children were out of sight, they were often out of mind entirely. Linda was quiet for a long time, studying the photograph. What happened to her, to Emma? Sarah told her about the asylum records, about Emma's death from pneumonia and malnutrition at age 12, about the unmarked grave. Linda wept openly. "She deserves better," Linda said finally. "She deserves to be remembered, to have her story told. I give you permission to share this publicly. I want people to know what happened to Emma Hendricks. I want her to finally be acknowledged." Sarah organized a press conference at the Kansas Historical Society. She displayed the photograph with the ghostly outline of Emma clearly visible, explained the research process, and told Emma's story, a child institutionalized for developmental disability, erased from her family's history, dead within 16 months of being sent away, buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten for over a century. The response was overwhelming. National news outlets picked up the story. Disability rights organizations praised the exposure of historical ableism. Historians began examining other family portraits from the era, finding similar erasures of children deemed defective or embarrassing by their families. But the most moving response came from the disability community itself, who saw Emma's story as emblematic of how society had treated, and in many ways still treated, people with disabilities as disposable, as embarrassments to be hidden away rather than family members deserving of love and dignity. Within weeks, the disability rights community in Kansas organized a memorial for Emma Hendricks. They raised funds to purchase a proper headstone for her unmarked grave at the former Osawatomie State Hospital Cemetery. and planned a service to finally acknowledge her existence and honor her memory. On a warm September morning, over 300 people gathered at the small cemetery where Emma and hundreds of other forgotten patients had been buried. Most of the graves were still unmarked, their occupants anonymous, their stories lost. But today, Emma would finally be remembered. The new headstone was simple but dignified, gray granite with carved flowers. Emma Hendricks, 1892 to 1905. Beloved child never forgotten again, Linda Patterson spoke first, her voice shaking. I represent the Hendricks family, and on behalf of my ancestors, I want to apologize to Emma. What was done to her was wrong. She deserved love, support, and dignity. Instead, she was hidden away and erased. I'm sorry, we're all sorry. And we promise that your story will be told, that you will be remembered. Dr. Catherine Morrison, an advocate for disability rights, spoke about how Emma's story represented thousands of similar cases. Children institutionalized for disabilities, learning differences, or simply for being inconvenient to their families. Emma Hendricks was a real child with hopes and fears, who deserved to grow up surrounded by love. Instead, she spent her final months in an institution and died alone at age 12. We cannot change what happened to her, but we can ensure that her story serves as a reminder of why disability rights matter, why inclusion matters, why every person has inherent worth regardless of their abilities. Sarah spoke about discovering the photograph and the investigation that followed. She held up a large reproduction of the family portrait, the ghostly outline of Emma clearly visible. The photographer who took this picture in 1904 deliberately left evidence of Emma's existence, because he knew what her family was doing was wrong. He couldn't refuse their request without risking his livelihood, but he could ensure that someday someone would see what had been done and ask questions. Today, we honor both Emma and that photographer's silent protest. After the speeches, people laid flowers on Emma's new grave. Many brought teddy bears, children's books, and toys, symbols of the childhood Emma had been denied. Linda Patterson placed a framed copy of the original family portrait before Emma was erased, showing all 5 children together. "This is how you should have been remembered," Linda whispered, kneeling by the grave. "As part of your family. I'm sorry it took so long." The discovery of Emma Hendricks' erased portrait sparked a broader movement. Historians and genealogists across the country began systematically examining old family photographs at high resolution, looking for other erased children, other family members deemed too embarrassing or inconvenient to be remembered. They found dozens. A boy with Down syndrome erased from a 1910 portrait in Ohio. Twin girls with cerebral palsy, removed from an 1895 photograph in Pennsylvania. A teenager with epilepsy painted out of a 1907 family picture in Oregon. Each discovery revealed another forgotten child, another family's shameful secret. Sarah launched a project called the Erased Children Initiative, working with archives across the country to identify and restore these disappeared family members. Each child's story was researched, documented, and shared. Descendants were contacted when possible, and many expressed shock and grief at learning about relatives whose existence had been hidden for generations. The project also partnered with genealogists to identify unmarked graves at former institutions for the disabled, funding headstones and memorial services for hundreds of forgotten people. The cemetery at Osawatomie alone had over 400 unmarked graves, and through painstaking research, they were able to identify and memorialize nearly half of them. Linda Patterson became a passionate advocate for the project. She spoke at conferences about her family's history and the importance of acknowledging past wrongs. "My ancestors did something terrible," she told audiences. "They threw away a child who didn't meet their expectations, then erased her from history. I can't change what they did, but I can make sure Emma and children like her are finally remembered and honored." The original Hendricks family portrait became one of the most viewed items in the Kansas Historical Society's digital collection. Schools used it to teach about disability rights history, about how attitudes toward people with disabilities have evolved, and about the importance of inclusion and acceptance. Sarah continued her work as an archivist, but Emma's story had changed how she approached every photograph. Now she looked more carefully, asked more questions, wondered about the stories hidden in plain sight. She examined every family portrait at high resolution, looking for ghostly outlines, for gaps in composition, for evidence of erasure. History isn't just about the people who were remembered. Sarah told students who visited the Historical Society. It's also about the people who were deliberately forgotten, whose stories were erased because they didn't fit the image their families wanted to project. Our job is to find those erased stories and bring them back into the light. The photograph of the Hendricks family still hung in the Society's exhibition hall, but now it was properly labeled The Hendricks Family 1904, portrait showing deliberate erasure of Emma Hendricks, 1892 to 1905, who was institutionalized for developmental disability. Discovered through high-resolution imaging, 2024. Visitors stood before it daily, looking at the ghostly outline of a child whose family had tried to erase her from existence, but who had finally, after 120 years, been restored to her rightful place in history. Emma Hendricks would never be forgotten again. And neither would the thousands of other children like her, hidden away in institutions, erased from family photographs, buried in unmarked graves, their stories lost to shame and stigma. One by one, they were being found, remembered, and honored. The photograph looked like an ordinary family portrait at first glance. But zoom in, look closely, and you could see what had been hidden. A child who deserved better, a family's shameful secret, and one photographer's silent protest that finally, more than a century later, had been heard.